Our next witness is Courtenay, is it?
That's correct, sir.
Courtenay.
Please state your full name.
Courtenay Hildyard.
Take the book in your raised hand
Good.
and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Courtenay, when you were a child, you were very active and adventurous. What kinds of things did you enjoy doing?
I lived in the country, so we had animals and I guess running around doing stuff and climbing trees and the usual things that youngsters do in the countryside.
You were also
Working
involved-
on farms and things.
working on the farm.
Yeah.
You were known as a bleeder, but did you have very many problems with bleeding as a youngster?
I think I tended to sort of dismiss it over the years, but I think in hindsight it did affect me quite a lot. And I think really, given the time that I grew up, I'm not quite sure how my parents coped. I mean, I suffered a lot from nosebleeds, so it was a time, before kitchen roll was available, before tissues were well available, when we still had shiny loo roll. And it really, towels were the only, if you were bleeding for days, it must have been a nightmare for them.
In 1963, you were diagnosed with low adhesion platelets.
Yeah.
And then in 1970, you had a dental extraction and bled quite significantly after that.
Yeah.
What were you diagnosed with after that dental extraction in 1970?
1970, they decided that I had von Willebrand's. I had a low alpha theta, a low factor 8. I think it was called anti-haemophilic factor then. As they decided me, I wasn't a haemophiliac. I had von Willebrand's, largely because my mother had been a bleeder, and it was thought at that time that a woman could only be a carrier and not suffer from haemophilia. But basically, I was a haemophiliac. But that's why I was given a card to say I was suffering from von Willebrand's.
So in that early stage, it was diagnosed as von Willebrand's.
Yes, yeah.
And then can we have document 2344012, Paul, please? And we can see it's a letter from September 1977. And in the middle paragraph, it says that you had been retested and your factor 8 clotting activity is 28%, factor 8 related antigen 93%, and platelet aggregation with ristocetin is normal. These results exclude classical von Willebrand's disease and show he has mild haemophilia A. So at this stage in 1977, you were diagnosed with mild haemophilia A as opposed to von Willebrand's.
Yes. I think that was because they then knew that a woman was not just a carrier, could be a haemophiliac.
In the 1960s, you had moved to Newcastle to work in the pathology department at the Royal Victoria Infirmary, and then moved on to the General Hospital,
Yes.
where you stayed working until 1973.
Yes.
You said earlier to me that you had a close friend who worked in the haematology labs then.
Yes. Yeah.
What were you aware of about blood and blood products through that friend?
I think it was not just through him. I think the very fact that the regional blood transfusion service was on the 2 floors below the building, so that the whole regional transfusion service took place from there. They went out to collect blood, so there was very much it was part and parcel of the whole process. But I think we were quite proud of the fact that it was a voluntary service, and we were, I think, quite smug, in fact, I think, that we were sort of like a world leader in the ethics of blood collection and donor.
You said earlier that there was a sense in the laboratory that you were smug about the British products.
Yeah, I think so. I think as things have changed so much now, I mean, I think there was a feeling of belonging for communities, and the very fact that collection teams went out to village halls and to factories and to women's institutes, and people felt as though they were giving something back to it. I think there was not a pride within the community that there was a contribution to. Everything was advertised as a gift of life. All the transfusion vehicles were labelled with that logo. So it was.
Did you ever have any conversations about American products?
I can't remember specific conversations, but I think it was generally known that it was because donors were paid. I think that was the crucial thing, and there was little control over the people who were donating blood. Whereas in this country, if you'd had jaundice, you couldn't give blood, and I don't think that really applied in practice in the States. And I think there was a sort of Skid Row clinics was sort of, that was the term that was used. You know, it was as though it was a low quality product. You know that it.
And you said earlier you remember those sorts of discussions going on when you were in the labs in the 1970s.
I can just remember one specific. Well, no, yes, I think it was part and parcel of that sort of feeling of you know, at least we have a decent, whatever the States do, and however good they are, and however, you know, fiddling we are in the UK, at least our sort of transfusion service is quite good, and we're proud of it.
After you finished working in the hospital labs, you worked in film and advertising, and built up something of a property portfolio.
Yes, yeah.
Then on the 26th of October 1981, you had an operation to remove a spermatocele. And if we can have document 2344011, please, Paul. We can see in the middle of this letter, dealing with the operation, this was treated surgically under the cover of infusions of factor 8. Yes?
Yes,
do you remember that?
Yeah.
Were you aware that you were given factor 8 at this time?
No, not at all. I mean, the first I knew of that was when I managed to obtain my hospital records, I think a year or so ago, a year and a half ago.
By this time you were married?
Yes.
You had a photographic studio and contemporary art gallery in Newcastle?
Yes. Yeah.
And you'd bought your dream house on the North York Moors?
Yes. Yeah.
You'd planned to settle there with your wife and have a family?
Yeah.
In June 1983, you had an accident when you were roller skating. Can you tell us about that?
I was asked by Newcastle Council, because of my supposed skill at skating, to check out Jesmond Dean as a proposed venue for a roller skating spectacular. And it's a very steep-sided slope, and I managed to find some excavation on one of the paths and had a bit of an accident and damaged my knee. And
you're very softly spoken. Could
sorry,
you just
sorry.
speak up a little bit more
yes,
so everyone can hear you?
No, I do mumble. Sorry.
So you had the roller skating
Yes.
accident, you injured your knee, and you went into the RVI in
Yes.
Newcastle.
Yeah.
And what happened?
I wanted, all I said I needed was sort of bed rest and, you know, not a bag of peas, but frozen compress. And because I was in a lot of pain, my leg was totally stiff. I had quite a large swelling. And they kept me in and treated me. Well, I think initially they thought perhaps I had an infection, even though I was convinced it was a joint bleed. And they took me to theatre to do an investigation. And it turned out that it wasn't an infection, it was a bleed.
And at one point you had a conversation with the consultant.
Yeah, I didn't want any blood products. I was quite adamant about that because I think that that was part of my philosophy. I think blood is quite a precious thing, and there's always an element of risk with blood transfusions, and I felt it had no application, and I refused any blood products. And the consultant assured me that it was perfectly safe, and on that basis, I thought that it was. I knew there was a new chemical on the market that had coagulant properties, which I now know as DDAVP, and I assumed that's what I was getting.
Can you tell us anything else about that conversation just before you were given the product?
The consultant asked the sister who was there to confirm that I hadn't been treated before, which I don't know why. I mean, I had no knowledge of that reason, but it does stick in my mind.
And the nursing sister said you hadn't, which
yes.
Actually we know is not right.
True, which is,
but your recollection of the conversation is that the nursing sister said no, you hadn't received
absolutely.
any
She confirmed that what he thought, that I had not been treated before.
And by treated, you mean what? Treated with what?
With, I assume, blood products, or what? As I say, that I wasn't really. When you're in pain and stuff, you don't take conversations, but they just stick in my mind. They were her words, that she assured him that I had not been treated before.
So that, in the context, that had to relate to blood products.
I assume so, yeah.
Please can we have document 2344004, please? We can turn it round and highlight the entry towards the end, which indicates that you were, on that occasion, given cryoprecipitate at 1500 hours.
Yeah.
You think you might also have received factor 8, but it's not entirely clear whether that was the position or whether you only received cryoprecipitate at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
And although you've gone through your records and we've gone through your records, we can't track exactly what you received at that time.
Yes.
You underwent the surgery to the knee to exclude infection, and you were then discharged and went on holiday to Portugal with your leg in a splint, in a cast. What happened while you were out there?
Well, I think basically I spoiled everybody's holiday. I was such a misery, and I was not well. I was sick, and I turned yellow fairly early on. And there was obviously something amiss. So we were there for 3 weeks. By the time we came back to the UK, largely my colour had started to return to normal. So really they didn't see that much evidence of my jaundice.
But you're clear that while you were in Portugal, you'd been very unwell and had gone yellow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When you got home, you went to the hospital, and what did they say?
They assumed that it was because of my treatment, and I assumed that it was because of cryoprecipitate that I'd received that.
In terms of what they said to you, they confirmed it was non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes, that's what they called it then, yeah.
And what were you told about the long-term prognosis?
I was really concerned because I had a pretty active job and I was very much committed to it, and I was told that I would make a complete recovery. In fact, I couldn't work for a year. I was not good. And within that year, my bank actually considering trying to make me bankrupt, having described me as a rising star the year before. So that was a bit of a problem. But I assumed that from what they told me that I would make a complete recovery. And I think that the jaundice and the hepatitis was considered to be relatively minor, or I assumed, that's the impression I was given, that wouldn't have a long-term effect.
You've said in your statement that the consultant assured you that you'd make a complete recovery and would have no further problems.
Yes, yeah.
But as you say, you were unwell for about a year, and things with your business were going horribly wrong. Well, in fact, everything fell apart, basically, the gallery, the studio, because I obviously was the driving force behind it, and from day one, it was just impossible to work at all. You and your wife decided to return to London in about 1985,
Before that, probably 84, 83, the end of the 83, 84.
83, 84. And then in about 1985, you received a letter to say you were negative for HTLV3.
Yes, yeah.
What did you understand that to be about?
Well, at first we didn't really know. I mean, I think we assumed it was HIV, but it was all sort of a new area that we knew nothing at all about. We just assumed that's what it meant. As I said, I was out of touch with the haemophilia department. I was back, I was working, 7 days, 7 nights a week or whatever, trying to get back to where we were. And it was, in a way, incidental. It didn't have a great deal of meaning. I was supposed to sign in with Professor Savage at St. Thomas's, but never did, because, as I say, I had no need to. So I never really moved on from the RVI in Newcastle to the London hospital. So I think to a large extent they lost touch with me.
Had you been told you were being tested for HTLV3?
No, not at all, no.
By about 1985, it had become more clear to you and your wife that the hepatitis was more serious than you'd understood.
I don't think as much we put it on the head. I was just not well. I mean, we knew that there was something amiss. We knew I just didn't feel good at all, and I think that continued. And there was nobody who said, yes, this is what it is, and that's to be expected. We had no communication. It was only much later when in '93 or so, when I collapsed, that my GP started to look at things with some enthusiasm.
Sadly, while you were in London, your wife was pregnant, and she lost the baby when she was knocked over in a tube station. We have a statement from your wife, and we have her permission to discuss it with you. She said in her statement that once you both realised the dreadful implications of hepatitis C, you felt it was irresponsible to try and have another baby. So she says she's been robbed of any chance of a family life. Was that something you discussed together?
I don't think so. I think we just really just sort of bashed on together, worked together. We closed our minds to options. Really, I think we had no choice financially, and I think I always felt that we didn't know what the problem was. We knew that I wasn't well, and because there was no guidance or information, then we really had nowhere else to go. So we just ploughed on with what we were doing. I don't feel as though we had an option really to discuss that either financially, or we were both working very hard to try and get back to where we'd been, some sort of stability.
As you say, you were in London and you had managed to work again at Pinewood Studios. Your wife was working, but you continued to feel unwell. Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly how you were feeling?
Working in the firm, you start work very early, you work late, and it was an immense struggle. I mean, without any guidance, we just knew something was amiss, and it was a permanent problem. And eventually, I did collapse. I found I got out of the business because I realised it was too much for me, and it was just quite unrealistic to continue doing what I was doing.
As you say, you collapsed in 1993.
Yeah, that was after I set up as a photographer's agent, and it was just beginning to make sense when I did eventually collapse in '93 and went to see my GP in London.
And what happened then?
She looked at my records and decided there was still a question mark about the hepatitis, and instigated some further investigations at the Royal Free.
Your GP had gone back through your records and seen that you had periodic tests in the 80s of your liver function, and they had been slowly increasing over time.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I mean, I think that in a way that was a bit remiss of the people who treated me, because I think that was an indication that something was changing and was not quite in keeping with what they'd told us. I think initially, if we'd been given any words of warning, even if they didn't know what the future held, if they said, well, actually, we don't know what the prognosis is, perhaps you should be a little bit more careful as to what you're going to do, I think we would have just stayed put in Newcastle, which I think would have been a totally different story.
You've said and you feel that if you had had any inkling that there was a major issue or a possible major issue,
Yeah.
you simply wouldn't have uprooted down to London.
Oh, no, not at all. No, I mean, we were perhaps a bit cavalier, and I think, but not stupid. I mean, I think that, you know, we were perfectly capable of making things work there. We had property and had a perfectly good job. You know, it was not a problem. I think it was just trying to go back to where we were, the business. I knew I could earn more money doing what we did do, in theory, than treading water. I think there's a degree of, I don't know if it's any illness, but I mean there's a degree of lunacy takes over when you're still driven to get back to where you were without having all the same abilities that you had before, and certainly without the mental not strength but understanding, and I think it makes it difficult. I'm pretty sure I did things that were, in hindsight, were really silly. You know.
Because you were trying to sort out the financial mess that had arisen from the Newcastle gallery and studio from your...
And we'd sold our property in Newcastle with a view to moving to London anyway, where property was, for some reason, was still very cheap, whereas it started to move in Newcastle. And the money we had, we could have probably bought maybe 2 or 3 houses in Highbury, Islington, which were selling then for probably less than 20,000 each. And I think we sold it for somewhere close to 100,000 in the end. And that was the plan. And then we delayed things because Anne finished her college, and then of course illness changed all that.
And so you're in London trying to recoup what's gone wrong. And 1993 you've collapsed. You were referred to the hepatology department in London, and in 1994 started on interferon treatment for 6 months.
Yes. Yeah.
What was that like for you?
We'd been burgled at the house, so I decided to go there whilst I was on treatment in order at least to sort of man the barricades, as it were. But initially stayed in London, and interferon had such a... Well, I think it just changes your whole personality. I became almost a threat to man and beast, really. I was very difficult to live with, and we separated on that basis. I would be in the north and Anne was in London. But that seemed to justify my being there, that at least I felt I was doing something whilst I was on treatment. But it's an unbelievable... for me, anyway, it was an unbelievable treatment. I was totally deranged, I suspect, and had, quite a bad accident while I was there. I think your reasoning powers disappear almost completely, I think, really.
So at that stage, during the treatment, your wife and you separated.
Yeah.
And you were back up in the north.
Yes.
In a house up there while she was in London.
Yes.
You've described the interferon treatment as a friend had said that he wouldn't give interferon to a dog.
Yes, he was a vet. Yeah. But I did do one thing. I mean, it actually stopped me working, which I probably don't think I would have had the sense to do that. I think I'd have just tried to keep on working. Eventually dropped in, I don't know, failed. So it did do one good thing, but as I say, it had quite serious consequences.
You've said in your statement that it had a huge impact on your mental and physical faculties, and you had to stop work. Financially, things became quite difficult, and you tried to activate various insurance policies you had in relation to your mortgage and bank loans. What happened with that?
Well, they decided that, I think in the benefit of hindsight, that the jaundice and hepatitis were sufficiently serious that I'd assumed they weren't, and we hadn't mentioned them when we took out insurance policies on mortgages and loans. So they refused to pay, and that really was the start of suddenly had a fairly monstrous debt, which we had difficulty addressing.
Because when you signed those insurance policies, you and your wife understood the situation to be that there would be no long-term effects of
Yeah,
hepatitis.
I think the whole status of hepatitis was played down. I mean, the fact that it was well known that there would be long-term effects, I think, which had been known for years and years, and the effects really were unknown, but there would be some sort of consequence.
And at the time you signed those insurance policies, you had also been told that your factor VIII levels were normal.
Yes, yeah.
And you had been taken off the haemophilia register in about 1986.
Yes, yeah.
So when you signed those insurance policies, you'd also not had to declare anything about haemophilia.
Yes, yeah.
And yet they were refused.
Yes, yeah.
Around this time, you tried to get hold of your medical records.
Yes, yeah.
Why was that?
I think we really didn't know what had happened. I mean, we assumed it was an accident, but I think had doubts about it, and there were sort of, I don't quite know what instigated those doubts, but I think we felt we needed some sort of explanation. We were very much on our own in terms of knowledge and attention. We were just left to our own devices and couldn't quite understand that. And we wrote to, I say, every health minister, I think, since the early 80s. But of course, we were sure they'd been treated correctly. And you couldn't actually just access your medical notes then at all. It came in late, I think, in the 90s that you could, through a solicitor, you could apply to see them in, say, in the GP surgery. So it was not difficult to find out. It was difficult to find out what had happened.
Did you manage to obtain many records?
Only this year and a half ago, when I obtained my records from Newcastle. Yeah.
Your treatment in 1994 didn't clear the virus. Can we have document 2344013, please, Paul? And if we look at the main part of the letter, it's a letter from 2008, there's reference there to you drinking very little alcohol. When you got your records, elsewhere in your notes, there were references to significant alcohol intake. What's your view of how much alcohol you were actually drinking?
I'm not quite sure why they said I was drinking very little, because I don't think I was drinking any, and certainly in terms of any excess, I think that just wasn't true. I'm never quite sure where that came from. I did once ask my GP to say not to drink any alcohol at all in the very early days because I felt it didn't agree with me, and stopped anyway. But I was just drinking, wine in the evenings with a meal or whatever. I've never been a boozer per se, as it were.
But despite having stopped alcohol very early on, through your medical notes, you found references to having been drinking more substantially.
Yes, quite strangely. We never quite understood it until relatively recently, when we heard that it's been used by other doctors as an add-on to their records for perhaps no reason.
And if we see the main paragraph, it says he's considered his options carefully. He's now adamant he doesn't want retreatment with interferon under any circumstances. Why was that?
Well, one, it didn't work, and it really, I don't think I was the same after that ever, really. I mean, it's sort of, 6 months treatment and then probably 2 or 3 years to recover. It's time out of your life and with no effect whatsoever. I think my viral count dropped 6 months after I'd finished treatment a little bit, but that was it. So I felt it wasn't worthwhile. And in terms of the biopsy, I mean, I did have a bleeding problem, so it's a risky business. I suspected that it was just wanted to be done for academic purposes, really. They had no treatment to offer, even if cirrhosis had progressed. So I couldn't see the point in it.
So at that stage you were also declining a liver biopsy, and it says you were aware of the risks and decided not to.
Yeah.
2015, You did undergo treatment with Harvoni and Ribavirin.
Yes.
What was that like?
Relatively easy in comparison to interferon, but still had the same sort of flavour to it. But that was delayed. Treatment was delayed because I had an accident. I had an artery cut in my head, and was taken into hospital, and I was treated for a pseudo aneurysm. And whilst doing that, they found out that I had a raised alpha-fetoprotein, which is an indication of cancerous growth. So that was a bit of a problem. But they decided not to do anything until I'd had treatment with Harvoni. But treatment with Harvoni was delayed, I was told by my consultant, because the NHS had asked NICE not to release it because they didn't have the money for it. So that put back everything for quite a long time.
But when you did have the Harvoni, it cleared the virus.
Yes.
But as you say, in 2015 you'd also discovered that there were concerns, more serious concerns about your liver.
Yes.
Can you tell us what treatments you've undergone for that?
Initially they did, I think it was called TACE, where they put a catheter into your liver and surround it with chemicals, which is like a chemotherapy to try and seal off the tumour and destroy it. And then later I had what they call an ablation, which is like you insert a microwave rod really and burn it out. And then that was relatively stable, and I had a low alpha-fetoprotein, the growth enzyme. And then that started to rise again last June.
You were relatively stable from about the end of 2015, early 2016, until June last year.
Yeah.
And then what's happened since June last year?
Well, I used to get, when I see my consultant, I would get a blood form, and so I would go in 2 weeks before my appointment, so I had something to talk about rather than wait for the next time. So that was the end of June, and I had a raised alpha-fetoprotein again, and my consultant asked for another CT scan to find out what was going on. But for that, and then the joint disciplinary meeting, which took place, I think that happens every 2 weeks, and then to arrange to see the surgeon took something like 4 months, which was a little bit foolish. And then I couldn't be fitted in for an operation for another 2 months. So it was 6 months from that. And I went to theatre in the end of December, and I was anaesthetised, and then they found out that the tumour had moved from the body of the liver into the portal vein, so they couldn't do anything, which was a bit disappointing.
Then you said you had an excellent surgeon who scrambled over Christmas.
Yeah, people have been amazing. Yes, they've managed to get hold of some radioactive yttrium beads, which they installed in my liver in the January, which again the idea was that would destroy, or hopefully to destroy the tumour.
And what's happened since January?
Well, I don't think it worked quite. So it's still there, still active, and it is. We're not quite sure what the next step is. I was booked in to see the oncologist, and but that took a month to even. I phoned up after a month, and there was. My application was still there, but they booked in to see me, and they don't know what to do basically, because I think the chemotherapy that's available is limited success, and I think within the framework of the NHS they've got such a narrow field of choice because of the regulations and availability of products that it's. Where there's so much going on in the outside world, it's supposedly been a very exciting time for cancer treatment, so they say, worldwide and nationwide. But within the NHS, of course, they're so trapped within the system. There's very little they can offer at the moment. So I really don't know what the next step is. I'm due to see the professor next week, and we shall take it from there.
You think that in terms of conventional medicine, there's not much more they can offer you?
Within the health service, from what I can gather, where I am, yes. I think other places may be, there are other things on offer, and certainly within probably what they could now call integrative medicine, there are a lot of options which aren't part and parcel of the NHS regime.
And for those who aren't so familiar with integrative medicine, it used to be called something like complementary medicine.
Yeah. I think it's now accepted that there's more to healing than what is offered within traditional medicine. But I think that they're looking at drugs that are out of license, which are used for specific things. So basically, they're very cheap to use, and cocktails of these things rather than a specific drug which has been processed, and there's lots of money to be made within the pharmaceutical industry.
Emotionally, you've said in your statement that this has all taken a huge toll on you, but that you find it very difficult to talk about. Is there anything you want to say in relation to that?
Well,
you're welcome not to.
No, I think that I do feel actually guilty that I've dragged, the people around me who have loved me into, me doing almost like a headless chicken, pursuing what I did do without any guidance or advice as to nobody to say, well, hang on, perhaps you should think about this. With justification perhaps, because we were always hoping for some compensation and also for some truth, which might have affected my decision. So, in a way, I've just ploughed on over the years and dragged people around me with me. And I suspect that, in hindsight, that's been fairly selfish, not deliberate. It's by the way it's been, and I have some regrets on that.
Although you've been separated for 20 years, your wife continues to support you.
Yes, we decided to work together until something was resolved, and as I say, other people in my life have been the same. I've been very lucky that I'm well loved and supported in terms of what we've been trying to do, and we have, I suspect, from now on, yet another battle, which will be part and parcel of my own research and into what there is to offer to try and survive, really, which is what we did for 30 or so years of hepatitis. I have a very dear friend who's a doctor but works in the field of integrative medicine, and his philosophy was that we keep my liver sufficiently healthy until such times as there was a cure, and which we did by nutrition and diet and supplements, I guess, and that worked to a large extent. And I think that's we're back in that process.
In terms of the support that your wife's been providing for you over the years, she's also been supporting you financially, but that's now got to a crunch point for both of you.
Yes, she was supporting in terms of things like supplements and stuff like that. So we're very much separate in other fields. But no, she's an age and stage where she can't work. So I'm supporting her. We still have property, or she has property, which at the moment is unable to get any benefit because she has two properties. One, the house that we bought when the year I was given hepatitis, we've never lived in. So that's been what was meant to be a dream has been something of a nightmare, really.
And
so
you're
that's,
now trying to sell.
Yes,
you have
sell
tried
everything,
over the years to sell all of
everything. I have come to my senses at last and realised that I can no longer do what I've been trying to do for years, and it's.
And you're in the process of instigating insolvency proceedings.
Yes, yeah.
In terms of financial assistance from the funds, you've received stage 1 and stage 2 payments, but relatively recently you also applied for some other items, about 6 items.
Yeah.
What happened when you made that application?
To the NHS,
EIBSS.
EIBSS, yeah. They just send it back, said I had to apply for each thing individually, which is quite a long rigmarole. And you need 3 estimates for counselling, or 2 estimates, and to show a copy of the certificate of the qualification. And even for things like car repairs, you have to show 2 estimates. And so I'm not sure anybody will apply for these, because it's against another hurdle, which irritates me, because in a way the NHS is where we all started. There's a degree of responsibility, and I think that it should be rather easier than it's being made at the moment.
You'd applied for 6 things in one go.
Yes, I had to. Yeah.
And you were sent back 6 separate forms that you had to apply. You were told you had to apply for individually.
Yes.
1 item per form.
Yes, I think that, well, not a form. I think there was 3 double-sided forms for each application, so it's quite a process.
And for you, that's just been too overwhelming to try and do.
Yeah.
Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I'm sure there is. I'm really not very coherent. I think that there are a couple of things about the situation with blood and blood products, and I think that it always concerned me that, from my own, it was almost like a sort of worm's eye view of medicine and the state, that it was known that American products were inferior to the UK. And I think that the business of the UK products we considered to be a gift of life. I think that our community felt involved in that. And I think that I think if somebody had told me when I was treated in 1983 that there was a chance that I'd been given, or anybody being given, products from the States, I don't think I would have believed them. I think that it's not a question, and the government always says that there's never been a scientific consensus about the dangers of blood products. But I think they've asked the wrong scientists, or scientists with vested interest, primarily. And I think that it was more a question of common sense. If I was to meet, if somebody gave me blood, it's a body fluid exchanging blood which carries all the diseases that any individual has. So it's a dangerous process anyway, in a risky business. Once you start multiplying that, in the case of cryoprecipitate, 1 or 2 donors, but factor 8, which can be countless thousands, it's something that the average 10-year-old can work out quite happily. You don't need any scientific evidence at all. And I think that's something I find quite difficult, how they could have even considered importing it. But I guess it was about finance. There was somebody who was going to make a lot of money when they considered blood products as a commodity. As I said, in my notes, I wrote to the present Secretary of Health recently, having seen on television, who seemed to put blood products and medicines together, which is exactly what must have happened in the 70s, when you think suddenly they both come under the same banner, that they've both been tested to the same extent, and it's just not true. So I think that's things I find difficult to understand. Sorry, I probably ramble on.
I'm just going to turn and see if Mr. Williams, who is representing you, has any points he wishes for me to raise. There's just one point that Mr. Williams would like me to raise. We can't put the documents on the screen, but although you were told that there was no long-term implications of hepatitis C. In your medical records, in about 1983, July 1983, the blood results, I think you're aware because you've seen them, have been stamped with the symbol and the note biohazard.
Yeah.
Were you aware of that at the time?
No, I have absolutely no idea. That logo, which I've never seen before, and I have no idea what it means. There was always a problem, whether it was CJD at risk, I don't know. There's always been a problem as to whether I was at risk of CJD infection. I think largely because whether I'd been treated with factor 8 or not was read by different people at different times, and there was a bit of confusion about that. So different notes say, yes, I was at risk. And I gather my GP in London was informed in 2006, and I was never informed of that.
But in July 1983, the biohazard marking is put on your blood test results, and you weren't aware of that? No idea. I have no idea what it means until I received those records. Sir.
I think we will all have been appreciative of your quietly reflective account, which I think rather understates what you have suffered over the years. So can I thank you for myself for doing so, and say that what you have said has been noted.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll take a break there. I think the way we will proceed is we will have time, I suspect, for a third witness before a slightly later lunch. But it does depend upon the view which Miss Richards has as to the time that the next witness will take.
There are a significant number of relevant documents that I will want to show during the evidence of the third witness.
Well, in that
so
case,
I don't think his evidence will be short.
Well, let's stick with the original plan then, and have lunch now, a slightly early lunch. It gives us all the more time, and nobody should feel pressed for time. I want to hear everything that anyone would wish to say to me.
Thank you, sir.
So we'll take lunch now and come back at 1:10. And then we hear from?
We will hear from Richard Warwick, and then after Richard's evidence, we will hear from Mrs. Q.
Thank you.